Hi everyone, my name is Kari Sahan and I am a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I'm also the EMI Doctoral Webinar Coordinator for this network, and today I'm happy to kick off our EMI Doctoral Webinar series with a webinar about my own research. My research looks at EMI implementation at universities in Turkey, but today I'm going to be sharing with you just a small part of my study. I'm going to focus on the pilot study for my research, and so let's get started. Here's a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to begin with some background information about the study. I'll then go into my methodology, my research design, the data collection and analysis techniques that I used. I'll share with you the findings from the pilot study, and then we'll briefly discuss some implications and limitations before wrapping up with the takeaway message. Now, as you probably know if you're watching this webinar, EMI is a growing trend around the world. Increasingly, universities across the world are teaching through the medium of English, even in contexts where English is not the native or first language of the majority of participants in that university, or even if English is not a recognized national language of that country. Now, research has pointed out that English medium instruction is often intertwined with internationalization and the trend among higher education institutions to internationalize. However, often the decision to teach through the medium of English is made through top-down decision-making processes. This is the case in Turkey, where my research is situated. In Turkey, higher education is controlled by a governing body called the Council of Higher Education. This body regulates the laws, the policies, the hiring processes, student admissions, all sorts of things for all higher education institutes. And that means that they also are the people who determine what medium of instruction will be used in different programs. Now, before I get into my study, I want to talk a bit more about the history of EMI in Turkey. So I just said that one of the primary motivations for the expansion of EMI is internationalization. However, in Turkey, we see that the history of teaching through English or another foreign language actually dates back to Ottoman times. And we see this starting in 1863. And so towards the end of the Ottoman period, the trend to teach through a language that was not the local language, through a foreign language, was predominantly found in secondary schools, and these were mostly elite institutions. If we look at the Republican period and we start to look at the introduction of EMI at the university level, we see that the first university in Turkey to teach through English was Middle East Technical University, and this decision was made in 1956. Following this, Boğaziçi University in Istanbul also made the decision to teach through EMI, and then later in the 1980s, we see private institutions beginning to teach through EMI, including Bilkent University in Ankara as the first private institution. Now, all three of the universities that I just named, as well as some of the other early implementers of EMI, were full EMI universities, so everything was taught through English. And these were, at this time, so in the second half of the 20th century, EMI was primarily limited to elite universities in Turkey, and so those who were studying there were really among the country's elite. However, since the 2000s, we have seen an expansion of EMI programs in Turkey, and this expansion parallels an expansion of the higher education system overall. So that means there are more universities in Turkey, but that also means that there are more students who are studying at university, and for the purposes of my study, there are more students who are studying through the medium of English. And so EMI is no longer just limited to elite universities, but it's quite expansive throughout the country. And as part of this expansion, we see two types of EMI programs in Turkey. The first is 100% EMI programs, where every course that you take for your degree is taught through the medium of English. And the second is a 30% EMI program, in which a minimum of 30% of your coursework must be done through English. So that means if you take 10 courses for your degree, at least 3 of those courses must be taught through EMI. And in Turkey, in order to ensure that students are properly prepared linguistically for the demands of EMI, universities have what is called the English Preparatory Program. This is an intensive English program. It spans between 9 months to a full year, and students who do not score high enough on initial placement exams are required to take these intensive classes for the entirety of the academic year and pass this program in order to enroll in their English medium courses. So that's a little bit about some of the policies and the history of the policies governing EMI in Turkey. But the question that I'm left with is, well, what does this actually look like in practice? If we have the Council of Higher Education making top-down decisions on policy, how do those translate into language practices and teaching practices and learning practices by the teachers and students who are on the ground in the classrooms? And this is the motivation for my study. Now, before I jump directly into my study, I want to just begin by sharing with you the definition that I use for EMI. There's a number of different definitions out there. Many people define EMI in different ways. The definition that I use is the definition written by Ernesto Macaro, and this definition says that EMI is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. So what this means, in what I'm taking as my definition of EMI, is that the primary aim of an EMI course is content learning. There are no explicit language learning aims or no explicit language learning outcomes. Instead, English is the tool by which content is delivered. And this is a bit different from other educational provisions, such as CLIL, which, at least in theory, has the dual aims of both content and language learning. So moving forward to my study, what I'm going to talk about today is just the pilot for my larger DPhil study. My PhD asks 3 questions. It looks at policies, practices, and the gaps between them. But for today, I'm just going to look at the second research question of mine, which is how are languages used in university-level EMI engineering classes in Turkey? Of course, this is a broad question. I have some sub-questions as well, but for the sake of the pilot study, this is what I'm trying to answer today. And in order to answer that question, I'm using a variety of different research collection methods and analyses. Here's a brief overview of my research design. I use classroom observations, interviews with lecturers, and also focus groups with students to collect data. I begin with a classroom observation. Following that first observation, I interview the teachers. This is a semi-structured interview in which I ask the teachers about their experiences teaching through English, as well as their general attitudes and beliefs about EMI. I then have a second set of classroom observations, and following these observations, I have a second interview with lecturers in which I use simulated recall procedures in order to dig a bit deeper into what the lecturers were thinking while they were lecturing in English. And I have a focus group interview with students in order to bring in the student perspective. My classroom observation data is analyzed through a structured coding scheme, and I use qualitative content analysis for the interviews and focus group data. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But the sample for my pilot study was one mechanical engineering department at a state university in Turkey. So I'm just focusing on 3 lecturers at one university for this pilot study. The university is a public university located in a major city in Turkey. It's a small university, and it primarily focuses on engineering and other STEM-related subjects. My 3 lecturers are all full-time lecturers in this department. They have PhDs in mechanical engineering. They're Turkish nationals and L1 Turkish speakers. And they're all relatively experienced lecturers. So they have a minimum of 9 years teaching experience in their subject area, and they all have a minimum of 5 years experience teaching through EMI. For each class, I had a focus group session with students. That was a total of 19 students in 3 focus groups. 15 of my students were male and 4 of them were female. Now I know this is not a perfect gender balance, but it actually does reflect the reality of the gender ratio of students enrolled in this particular engineering department and also broadly in engineering departments. This was a 4-year degree program, and my students were 2nd and 3rd year students. As my primary method of data collection was through classroom observations, I want to share with you the amount of data that I collected from that for this pilot study. I have 3 teachers, and I've used a pseudonym for each teacher, so this is not their real name. I had 2 sets of classroom observations, but because these are university classes, the lessons are blocked together into several hour sections. So you can see here that in total, I had about 14 hours of recorded classroom observations, and that was an average of about 50 minutes per class. And for each teacher, I had a minimum of 2 blocks, or the equivalent of 4 individual lessons. So 2 blocks of 2 lessons, or for the case of my second teacher, 2 blocks of 4 lessons. To analyze my classroom observations, I used a structured coding scheme that allowed me to get an overview of how language was used and what sort of classroom practices we see in each teacher's lecture. The structured coding scheme let me code language, speaker, language functions, code switching, and length of turn, so how long someone was talking. I coded my data using the structured coding scheme, and then in order to assess intra-rater reliability, I then 6 months later recoded it, and I found a strong level of agreement with the Cohen's kappa of 0.82. For my interviews and focus groups, I used qualitative content analysis. This is an iterative process of inductive coding. It relies on double coding, and you can see the steps that I followed here. Essentially, it consisted of developing a coding scheme, doing a trial coding with that scheme to see if it works, evaluating and modifying the scheme based on how well it fit the data, and then if necessary, repeating the trial coding scheme before beginning the main coding phase. And the primary purpose of my interviews and focus groups were to triangulate the classroom observation data. So let's jump into my findings. I had 3 teachers, and this graph here, this chart here, gives you a basic overview of the language they use inside of their 3 classes. So you can see there's actually quite a lot of diversity. If we look at teacher 1, Hanza, he used primarily English in his class. So in this bar graph, the blue represents English, the red represents Turkish, and the green at the top represents bits that are intersentential code switching between the 2 languages, so it really couldn't be coded as one or the other, but it was a mix of the 2. And you can see that while the first teacher used a majority of English, my third teacher, for example, used a majority Turkish, and the second teacher was somewhere in between. So from this macro level overview, we can see 3 very different profiles. And I want to take you a little bit more in depth into each of these profiles. So let's start with teacher 1. I'm calling him Hanza. Hanza was teaching a second-year course in statics. His class was English dominant. Almost 90% of the recorded lecture was in English. He used very little Turkish. The only Turkish that we saw inside of this class was students asking questions. However, the teacher would respond in English. And so it was primarily led by the teacher. Teacher talk accounted for about 2/3 of the class, and teacher-student interaction accounted for less than 20% of the total class time. But I want to give you an example of what some teacher-student interaction did look like in this class. I'm going to give you a minute to read this, although do feel free to pause the webinar and read this in more detail if you would like more time. In this example, we can see Hanza and the students in his class negotiating meaning in English. So they're sticking with English and they're working through a problem. This excerpt is from a problem in which they're trying to calculate the acceleration of a cart. And so the student begins by saying alpha A was wrong, it was not, and she sort of hesitates, so the teacher offers decelerating. But then in the preceding lines, in the following lines, we see a confusion over whether what we mean to say is decelerating or accelerating. So in these first lines here, we see the teacher and student going back and forth, trying to work out whether they meant that the cart was decelerating or whether it was accelerating. And then at the end, we see the second student comes in and he tells us we assumed wrong. So he gives a summary of what the problem was. The teacher then repeats this twice. So in this excerpt, you can see how, in order to make meaning in this classroom, the teacher and student are negotiating with each other in English, and the teacher is helping the students work through their English to answer the question. Well, when I asked the teacher a little bit about why I was saying these things in his class or why he was doing this in his class, he told me that he saw EMI as an opportunity to learn English. He was very much committed to staying with English and trying to be 100% English in his class. He said, I try to force the students. I'm always saying that there's a threshold in language learning, and if you pass that threshold, you will be okay. So he says, therefore, I am trying to be 100% English in my class. He then says, it's common for students to ask questions in Turkish, and I'm always saying, try to force yourself to ask in English. But you know, if I say it 100 times, on the 101st time, they still ask in Turkish. So with Hanza, we really see a commitment to keeping his class in English because he sees EMI as an opportunity for students to learn in English. However, this was not necessarily the case with my other 2 teachers in this sample. Teacher 2, Barak, was a 3rd-year strength of materials teacher. He was teaching a strength of materials course. His lecture was mostly in English, but he did use the students' first language, Turkish, in order to engage them and to facilitate learning. In this class, the students often asked questions in Turkish, and when they did, the teacher would often respond in Turkish. Notably, in Barak's class, I saw the highest level of teacher-student interaction out of all three of the teachers. About 35% of the class was characterized by teacher-student interaction, and these interactions occurred in English, in Turkish, as well as in a mix of both languages. So I want to give you a sense of what some of that interaction looks like now with this excerpt here. And in this excerpt, you can see that the language that Barak, the teacher, uses is really quite fluid. So he asks the students, is it plus or minus? And then the student responds, tu DPhil. It's not tu theta. He says this in Turkish, although you can see he said the number 2 in English. And then he and the teacher and the student go back and forth, a little bit of Turkish, a little bit of English, to work out what was wrong with the problem. And then at the bottom, at the bottom of this excerpt, you can see that the teacher understands what the problem was. He says, you are right. And then he continues with his explanation in English. So he's not at all fazed by this code switching that the student has done or by bringing in the L1. And he's perfectly willing to negotiate meaning with the students in whatever language they're comfortable using. When I asked him about that, he told me that his #1 priority in his EMI classes was teaching content. For him, content was the main takeaway. It was not about language learning. And so he told me, you don't have to lecture in English in order to learn the language. You don't have to take classes in English to learn English. He said, is our goal to ensure that students use English properly? No. Our real goal is to teach the subject material. And then he said, if a student can't express himself in English, let him ask in Turkish, and I'll answer his question. This is why, if you've explained a topic 3 or 4 times and the students still don't understand, then you need to explain it in Turkish. So with Barak teacher, what we see is that he's really emphasizing the importance of content learning, and he's willing to use whatever language is necessary in order to facilitate that, including using Turkish if and when the students might need it or want it. Now my third teacher in this sample is Jakub, and he is a second-year teacher, he is teaching a second-year course in thermodynamics. He primarily lectured in Turkish. Although the majority of his lecture was in Turkish, he did use English technical terms, and he used English materials. So all of the slides that he used were in English. And in his class, teacher-student interaction was primarily in Turkish. About 92% of all teacher-student interaction was in Turkish, although both teacher and student used English technical terms. So here's an excerpt of a little bit of a lecture from Jakub's class. And we can see at the beginning here that he begins with an English explanation. Again, I apologize that the slide is so crowded. You might want to pause the slide and take more time to read it if you need to. But he begins by explaining what fins are. And he explains in English before switching to Turkish, and he tells the students that they're very, very thin. The student then asks a question about the word fin. He asks if fin is actually meant to be blade, and the teacher tells him, no, it's not blade, we say fins. And then he provides an extended explanation, a technical explanation, in the student's first language, in Turkish. After he provides this explanation, he then switches back to English to say, so we have heat and cool, which is a thin tube, and he continues with the lecture. But what is perhaps notable about Jakub Hoca, as opposed to the 2 previous teachers that I showed you, is that he's perfectly fine offering extended explanations in Turkish, and he's also perfectly fine lecturing in Turkish, even though this is an EMI class. And so when I asked him about that, about his language choices, this is what he told me. He told me that he prioritizes content, just like Barak, but he also has some doubts about what the best medium of instruction practices are. So he said it's like this. I could say it in English, or I could answer them in Turkish, as long as the whole message is understood. If it's not understood, then we have to explain some things in our native language. But then he goes on to say, that might be a mistake. I don't know. Maybe I should force them to speak in English. What I thought was particularly interesting is that he then told me to go and talk to Hanza, my first teacher. He said, you should ask Hanza. He doesn't compromise. I mean, he says, you're going to ask in English, and I'm going to answer in English. He doesn't speak Turkish. We need to see if this approach is more effective. Maybe it's more beneficial. So what Jakub is saying here is that the decision he's making is to use Turkish when necessary because he wants students to understand. But he understands that some other teachers in the department are not doing that. Some other teachers are teaching exclusively through English and forcing the students to ask in English rather than Turkish. But with Jakub, we see some doubt. He's not sure which model is most effective, and he's not really sure what's most beneficial for learning. And so to sort of begin wrapping this up, this is a pilot study, so it's very small, and I only have 3 teachers. But what we see is that there's a great variation in terms of the language practices in EMI classrooms. These three teachers had very different attitudes and beliefs towards EMI, and they had very different profiles of language use in their EMI classes. This is in line with a lot of the language policy and planning literature that suggests that teachers serve as micro-level policymakers. So policy is not directly and automatically implemented in the classroom, but rather we need to take a more extended view of language policy and see the role that teachers play as arbiters in implementing policy in practice. It also raises the question of consistency. These three teachers teach very differently and they're in the same department. Does this mean that we need more teacher training? Or possibly do we need a more principled approach to L1 use in the classroom? Now, of course, this was a pilot study. It was a very small study. I only had one department. It was only at one university, and my main study uses a larger data set. However, in addition to the small sample size, there are still some limitations to this. One being my decision to use classroom observations. It's very possible that my presence in the classroom may have affected classroom language, and it may not have been as natural or as authentic as it is when I am not there. Another limitation is that I collected data through audio recording, so I don't have any video recording. And this lack of visual data does mean that I'm sort of limited in the richness of data available to me. So while I took copious field notes, I don't have a video recording of what's on the slides or what's being written on the board or the gestures and body language used by the teachers and students in these classrooms. One final limitation is that I'm interested in engineering classrooms and I'm seeing this diversity, but that still raises the question of how these things might play out or how EMI might be implemented in non-STEM subjects, for example, in the humanities or the social sciences. But in conclusion, the takeaway message from this research is that if we ask the question, how are language used in EMI engineering classrooms, we see that languages are used with a lot of diversity and fluidity. There was great variation in the language use and language preferences in these EMI classrooms. And what that tells us is that EMI is not English only, and it's not English always. Rather, EMI classrooms are multilingual spaces, they're bilingual spaces, and the teachers and students working in these classrooms, learning in these classrooms, are also multilinguals and bilinguals themselves. So in our conceptualization of EMI, we have to be willing to expand it away from this assumption of English always or English only, and perhaps think of more inclusive versions of EMI that account for that linguistic diversity in the classroom, as well as the reality that these multilingual users are bringing in the entirety of their linguistic repertoires into the classroom when they teach and learn in EMI settings. Here are the references I used in the slide today, in this presentation today, if you're interested. And here's my email address. Thank you so much for listening. I'd be very happy to talk with you further. If you have any questions or comments, do please feel free to send me an email. And then, as I said, this is the first in our EMI doctoral webinar series. If you're interested in making a webinar, recording a video, and having it uploaded, please contact me. I'd be happy to talk you through that process. And if you send me a webinar, I can help you upload it onto our website. Thank you very much, and I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.